So what is psychedelia? The term was coined in the 1950s by the psychiatrist Humphrey Osmond, who was researching schizophrenia. It is a juxtaposition of the Greek word psyche, meaning soul, and delos, meaning manifesting, bringing into light. Psychedelia, then, is an act of manifesting part of the soul that hitherto was hidden from consciousness. How is that achieved? Through the use of hallucinogenic drugs. Osmond claimed that hallucinogens, such as mescaline, induce a state that is similar to schizophrenia. As a scientist, he wanted to use that to generate temporary schizophrenia in people who volunteer to serve as subjects, and thus learn more about the phenomenon, and about the human psyche. Therefore, he referred to hallucinogens as psychedelic drugs. The fact that Osmond could run such tests teaches us something important about 50s mentality, and the Western culture of the time. On the one hand, it had deep fear of drugs, and the belief was that anyone who takes drugs will surely devolve into a criminal, or even worse, a beatnik. On the other hand, it had deep faith in science and the establishment, a belief that the government and the scientists know what's good for us. Scientists had almost free hand to run tests to expand human knowledge, and the government took the accumulating scientific knowledge and used it to engineer society, believing that this will produce a better humanity. And so, scientists could drug the human guinea pigs, and the latter volunteered with full trust that the scientists know exactly what they're doing, and will keep them safe. Doctors, meanwhile, generously administered drugs to help people cope with their daily life, and the people took them willingly, trusting the establishment. You can say that this is also the situation nowadays, but back in the 50s the contrast was sharper. Drugs that helped people to be productive were considered good, and people were encouraged to take them, while recreational drugs were considered bad, and those who got caught using them suffered serious consequences. Another thing we learn is that at first, the psychedelic act, meaning the act of manifesting the psyche, was perceived as its manifestation to someone who looks at it from the outside. Typically for scientists, Osmond placed himself as an objective observer, examining the consciousness of other people.
Are you talking about the reddish curtain behind Tubby?
Yes, and in fact it has the most extraordinary gradations of mauve and lights.
But his test subjects were not atoms and molecules, they were beings with a psyche. And they weren't mice or guinea pigs either. They were humans who could give their own account of the experience. The most famous volunteer in Osmond's test was the British novelist and intellectual Aldous Huxley, who published his account in a 1954 book called The Doors of Perception. Here, we find another interpretation of psychedelia. The drugs don't just manifest the psyche to the outside observer, but the subject himself learns more about himself through the experience of being drugged. Huxley relays the questions he was asked by the researchers, and the answers he gave, but claims that these questions and answers are insufficient to cover the entire experience. So he decided to write this book, in an attempt to do a better job and describe what he taught him about his soul. In the book, Huxley confronts his experiences with the history of Western and Eastern thought, and tries to develop new insights about the human psyche. The theory he proposes argues that the human sensory system is mainly a reducing valve. Our senses, he reasons, evolved to filter out big part of external world data, and present to us only the stimuli that is necessary and important for our preservation. This filtering system was required for human survival at a time when we had to hunt for our food and avoid predators, but now, when we live in the protected modern world, we can try to transcend it and develop a more sophisticated perception. Under the influence of psychedelic drugs, he writes, he found that he could perceive and process more sensory data, and felt himself more connected to nature and the universe. We encounter the first essential difference between Osmond and Huxley, a difference not dissimilar to the one I've made in the previous chapter between Marxists and the rock and roll kids. The former thinks of drugs only in the therapeutic sense. His aim is to heal the sufferers, to bring them to a state where they don't suffer anymore. Like Marxists, he doesn't acknowledge a higher state. The latter, on the other hand, is not satisfied with the state of non-suffering. This is only the initial state, the state we need to transcend to reach a happy state. Huxley is not content with just being healthy, he seeks transcendence. For us, the most interesting section is the one where Huxley discusses how music sounds under the influence. When the researchers played him a Mozart piece, he writes, it didn't sound much different than it normally sounds. Then again, 16th century madrigals, like the one we're hearing in the background, gained new life. and the singer's voice sounded more magical than they usually sound. Psychedelic drugs make every sound have a stronger effect, and so, pieces whose beauty is based on melody, on the linear progression of notes, do not benefit much from the altering of perception. On the other hand, pieces that are based on the beauty of a single sound vibrate in your consciousness much more powerfully than usual, causing elation. While linear pieces can be immediately grasped and understood, listening to non-linear pieces, those polyphonic pieces that contain several intersecting lines, made him feel like they belonged to a higher order, an order that the drug helped him begin to understand. The result of this insight is revealed in the part where Huxley goes into philosophical discussions, claiming that present-day Western culture gives too much credence to linear rational thought, while neglecting abstract thought. Due to contemporary education, which is based on words, humans tend to see as real only things that can be expressed in exact terms, only things that can fit into an organized system. Words confine us, prevent us from experiencing nature in an unmediated way. Only gifted people, like artists, are able to bypass this confinement. When he was under the influence, somewhat free from the reducing influence of the sensory system and linguistic concepts, nature was revealed to him as much richer and diverse than what he knew, and reminded him of the works of some painters, which made him realize that these painters actually perceive reality more truly. To prevent the erosion of the human spirit, says Huxley, we must learn to think like artists as well, not just like scientists. And psychedelic drugs, he believed, can help anyone perceive the universe like artists. The title Huxley chose for his book is taken from 18th century artist and mystic William Blake, who is known for his famous saying, "If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite." The doors of perception are the senses, and Blake is saying that our senses do not present the world to us in its purity, which means that science, which relies on the data of the senses, cannot reach the ultimate truth, but is trapped in our world where everything is temporary. If we could cleanse the senses to perceive reality as it is, we would see the divine and eternal things that he believed to be the truth. Huxley borrows from Blake for the title of his book, and in that he hints that psychedelic drugs are a way to cleanse the doors of perception, and grasp reality as it is. But unlike Blake, he does not believe in a divine world that is above our world, but rather looks for the truth in our world. Therefore, he does not put science on a lower level than the mystical approach, but seeks to combine science and mysticism, by using psychedelic drugs and what they reveal to us. A few years later, this aspiration found the man who would be its hero. Dr. Timothy Leary took a scientific approach to hallucinogens, but did not assume the role of an outside observer. Rather, he examined the effect of drugs on his own psyche. The sole manifestation of psychedelia, for him, was not something you could observe from the outside, but only from the inside, in your own mind. Psychedelic drugs, he believed, can open new horizons before humankind, and elevate us to new levels of knowledge. More than anyone else, Leary was responsible for spreading the word, and instilling the ideas of psychedelia in the minds of the 60s generation. Leary began his scientific career as a researcher of game theory, and was a respectable staff member at Harvard University. But everything changed in 1960, when he traveled to Mexico and tasted some magic mushrooms. Leary decided to dedicate himself to exploring the psychedelic experience, and justified it to the Academy by claiming that these drugs may help cure physical and mental illnesses. But his real goal was opening new spiritual paths for humanity. He conducted many tests in which he gave his subjects a drug called LSD, which, being a synthetic hallucinogenic drug, could be mass-produced and thus used generously in his experiments. LSD was a new drug, first produced in 1938, that was still unknown and therefore not illegal. It goes without saying that his experiments were very popular among the students who volunteered to be his subjects, but among the academic staff he was much less popular, and in 1963 was dismissed. Now free from the yoke of the Academy, he could dedicate himself completely to his research, and he purchased an estate in the village of Millbrook, New York, where he could have the peace and quiet he needed. There, he established the League for Spiritual Discovery, or LSD for short, a group that devoted itself to the spiritual and scientific exploration of the psychedelic experience. Beyond that, Leary wanted to spread the word to the general public, and for that purpose he started to write books. His first book, which came out in 1964, is called The Psychedelic Experience, and it is dedicated to Aldous Huxley, who passed away the year before. This book is very useful for our purposes, because it presumes to do exactly what we require for this episode: be a guide to the psychedelic experience. A psychedelic experience is a journey to new realms of consciousness, states the opening of the book, and adds that this experience transcends verbal concepts, space-time dimensions, ego, and identity. It proceeds to assert that this experience can be achieved in several ways, which requires special talents or a lot of practice, but lately it became accessible to anyone, through the proliferation of psychedelic drugs. But, says Leary in the second paragraph, the drugs themselves don't produce the experience. They are merely the chemical key. The nature of the experience depends on your cultural background, and the preparations you make before consuming the drug. For that reason, he decided to write this guide, to provide us with the background and preparation needed to be able to experience it ourselves. The appropriate cultural background, in Leary's opinion, can be found in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, a book based on Tibetan Buddhist practices. It is basically a guide, meant to be read in the ears of the deceased after their death. According to their belief, the soul is resurrected after death and enters a new living creature born into the world, but not before a 7-week period in which it travels through several stages. The Tibetan Book of the Dead guides it through this journey, and the goal is not to be reborn, but to dissolve into the infinite unity. The person who sits by the deceased's deathbed is reading the guide in their ears, and the soul of the deceased hears it, and it helps it remember the training it went through in the course of its life, and find its way. Each of the stages has its own characteristics and dangers, and in each of them there's a possibility to unite with the infinite. If the soul fails to find the way, it is reborn back into the world. Why should the soul desire not to be reborn? Because, according to the Buddhist view, life is suffering. The highest Buddhist aspiration is to reach a state of non-suffering, and breaking away from the circle of life and death achieves that. But it is also possible to reach a state of non-suffering within life, and the practice is therefore meant also for the living, not just the dead. The aspiration is to bring your consciousness to a state where it liberates itself from individuality and all the egotistical motivations and desires attached to it, and see itself as part of the infinite unity. By directing his consciousness towards the eternity beyond our world, man does his best to transcend his personal existence and thus free himself from the suffering of that existence. And the consciousness that manages to train itself to do that in the course of its life also has a better chance to permanently break away from the cycle after the death of the body, and thus achieve eternal non-suffering. Once again we encounter this distinction. My starting point, as someone whose mind was shaped by pop culture, is that there are 3 different mental states. There's a bad state of suffering, as the result of extreme pain, deficiency or loss. There's a neutral state of non-suffering, and there's a happy state of elation. The neutral state is the one I am ordinarily in, and I seek to avoid falling into a state of suffering and to leap into a state of elation as many times as possible. But then, there are groups of people who are ordinarily in a state of suffering, and that's not because they experience extreme pain or loss, but because the mind is shaped to hate elements that are integral to human existence, and suffers from their presence. In other words, their suffering is caused by their own worldview, which causes them to torture themselves over things that other people don't suffer from at all. While I enjoy my individuality, the Buddhist suffers from it. While I enjoy owning things, the Marxist suffers from it, and so forth. And as they dwell in this constant suffering, these people yearn to get to a state of non-suffering, and regard it as the highest state of existence. They know only 2 states, suffering and non-suffering, and they don't even acknowledge a higher state, the state of elation. It is important to remember this distinction, because it is significant to understand what distinguishes psychedelia, and pop culture in general, from worldviews like Buddhism. Where does Timothy Leary stand on that scale? Very close to the Buddhist approach. In his view, taken from his research in game theory, humans are born into a world where their mind is shaped by the language, beliefs and norms that their cultures instill in them. We are all basically playing games, abiding by their rules and aspiring to the targets that they pose as desirable. The games we play in Western society all place the ego at the center, and this leads to constant friction with the outside world and with other people, and therefore to suffering. The psychedelic experience, he claims, frees you from all games, makes you transcend the ego and fuse into something higher, and thus you are liberated from your daily suffering. For Leary, then, the fact that he is an individual who is different from others, and possessing individual desires that might lead to friction with other individuals, is something that brings him sorrow. I believe I don't have to explain why such a worldview will cause someone who lives in Western society to feel constant displeasure with life, and seek something else. However, there is a difference in tone between Leary and Buddhists. The daily suffering doesn't seem to be so acute in his description of it, whereas the psychedelic experience is not just described as a state of non-suffering, but also as intense ecstasy, as a state of elation. So he too recognizes only two states, but the ordinary state for him is that of moderate suffering, whereas the higher state is of elation, that also eliminates the suffering. From Huxley's book, we learn that Dr. Osman's method was to sit his subject in a chair and ask them to comment on outside impressions. Leary, on the other hand, tells us that in order to have the experience we must lie motionless, with our eyes closed, and experience our inner world. And just like in the Tibetan model, it is necessary to have someone next to you, to guide you through it. He describes the experience as a journey through several stages, which parallel the stages the deceased soul goes through in the Tibetan Book of the Dead. In the first stage, right after the drug intake, there's a feeling that your entire being dissolves. You feel as if your spine melts in a searing heat, which moves upwards, melts everything in its way and floods the brain with joy. This is also accompanied by some disturbing and scary physical sensations, but you must ignore them and know that there's nothing to be afraid of. The more essential fear is the existential fear, the feeling that your being dissolves into a white light, but you know that this is the essence of the experience, and this light is the thing that you must submit to. If you manage to become part of the light, the ego dissolves as well, and you are no longer aware of your personal identity, but feel yourself as pure energy, part of the energy field around you. This stage lasts only a few seconds, but if you completely submit to the light engulfing your being, it can be extended to several hours. In this stage, your thought is liberated of all the games in which it is usually involved, of all the concepts by which it categorizes the world, and becomes nothing but ecstatic joy. It is still aware of what is going on, but is devoid of self-consciousness. It achieves illumination and knowledge of the truth, and the truth, according to Leary, is that we are all part of the energy that the entire universe is made of, so we are all part of one unity. Our individual identity detaches us from this unity, places borders between us and the rest of existence, and getting rid of these borders makes us dwell in the kingdom of truth, and feel the ultimate joy. This joyful state is one that we want to remain in, and you can actually train yourself to remain in it until the intoxication wears off. With most people, however, the ego pulls down and lures you quickly back into self-consciousness, and you enter the second stage. The second stage is a stage of hallucinations. Numerous sights and sounds overflow your consciousness, with no order or reason. Leary interprets it as the content of our psyche that is presenting itself to us, but without the order that our mind usually imposes on it, because a mind altered by psychedelic drugs lacks the organizing ability it usually has. Hence we can see magnificent visions, weird creatures and unusual combinations, which the unaltered mind would reject as unrealistic and will not allow them to be presented. Those who come unprepared would find these visions to be monstrous and would try to escape them, but the one who's been well trained understands that these are just figments of the imagination, and views them calmly. Thus, you get a sort of an outside view of your own consciousness, understand the rules by which it organizes things, and realize that there are other possible ways to organize them. In that way you gain the ability to be free of the games that dominate your mind, since you understand that they don't represent any truth, but are just constructs that we impose on reality. The third stage is getting back to reality, which is parallel to the stage of rebirth. Just as in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, this stage determines in what form you will be born back into the world, so there are different ways in which we can return from the psychedelic experience. According to Leary, some people remain in the enlightened and happy state, and on the other hand there are people who do not regain their sanity. But these are extreme cases, and usually we return to ourselves, with the baggage we acquired on our trip. When the psychedelic experience nears its end, reality enters our mind, but still in the form of hallucinations, which can be a very frightening thing. Those who are afraid try to escape and have a bad exit from the trip, which can result in bad memories and even mental damage. But those who prepare themselves properly, and listen to the guide's instructions, can choose the moment and the way in which they reconnect with reality, and return happy and with greater knowledge of the world. These three stages, as mentioned, parallel the stages the soul goes through in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, from the moment of death to the moment of rebirth. The Buddhist teachings emphasize that there is need for a lot of preparation, lasting an entire lifetime, to do this journey well. But Leary assures us that the drugs allow us to circumvent the process, and that the experience is open for anyone. As we've seen, he notes that there are also dangers along the way, but it doesn't give them much weight. In his view, There is almost no danger as long as you have someone next to you to guide you through the trip. We also need to remember that Leary regards ordinary life as suffering, so he believes that anything that can free you from that suffering is worth the risk. And so, Leary published his book to the general public, and took the liberty to preach to everyone that they should take LSD to reach enlightenment. To the rebellious 60s youth, you didn't have to say more. As we've heard from both Leary and Huxley, one of the characteristics of the psychedelic experience is the shattering of the linear order by which we ordinarily arrange reality, and the flooding of consciousness with stimuli that attack it from many directions. In the mid-60s, this experience began changing the pop music world, as rock bands tried to recreate it musically, using the novel effects that recording technology provided them with. The Beatles, who early on recorded all their music to make it sound like a live performance, started to think differently about their art, and in 1966 they began to treat the record as an art piece in itself, meaning a concoction of innovative sounds created with studio technology, which cannot be produced anywhere else. For the record Tomorrow Never Knows, they used the gimmick of a tape loop, taking a short tape of random noise and gluing its two ends together to create a repeating sound. The record is structured around a consistent buzzing drone like in Indian sitar music, joined by drums that sound like a cosmic Indian tabla, and 5 tape loops of different length that come in and out and create an A-linear musical chaos. Out of this tumultuous ocean, John Lennon's voice emerges as if coming from the void, and invites us to join him on the trip. Most of the lines are quoted directly out of Leary's book, and they tell us to let go of ourselves, dissolve into the oneness of being, and realize the truth at the basis of existence. But Lennon adds something that we don't find in Leary. The thing you find on your trip is that love is all and love is everyone. Leary's oceanic unity is interpreted here along the lines of Western Christian mysticism, as a feeling of love that dwells in everything and unites us all together. This is the message of the psychedelic experience as the Beatles understood it, and as most of their generation would understand it. Thus ends the 3rd chapter of our story, and thus also ends the preparation stage. We are ready to go on our musical trip. In the next chapter, we will get to know the vehicle that will take us there.